From Brigham Young University's Maxwell Institute, this is the Maxwell Institute podcast, Faith Illuminating Scholarship. Today I have for you an interview with Professor Andrew Reed, who is the Richard L. Evans Chair of Religious Understanding and an Associate Professor at Brigham Young University. I invited him on the show to talk about interfaith engagement, which is one of the Maxwell Institute's 4 research initiatives. As current holder of the Evans Chair of Religious Understanding, Andy is an affiliate fellow with the Institute, and we've begun partnering with him to promote efforts at BYU and beyond that foster understanding among people of differing religious faiths. We couldn't ask for a more experienced leader for this initiative. Dr. Reed is an expert on the history of relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and the founder of the BYU Council for Interfaith Engagement. He recently published an article in BYU Studies Quarterly titled, "Where Risk and Reward Meet, Interfaith Engagement and Learning." And we use that as the jumping-off place for our discussion. The conversation is packed with interesting ideas from Dr. Reed, but my favorite was a new insight he shared about the 2 great commandments, to love God and to love our neighbor. Andy wondered what would happen if we learned from our practice of the first commandment, love God, how to better observe the second commandment. We approach God with respect and awe and wonder, what if we approached our neighbor with a similar respect, awe, and wonder? We only worship God, of course, but I found that in my most meaningful relationships, when I've truly been able to see the image of God in another person despite our differences, I've experienced something like wonder. I felt called beyond myself in a way I recognize from my worship of God. I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Andrew Reed. Andy Reed, welcome to the Maxwell Institute podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are a professor of religious understanding. So as a professor, tell me, is religious understanding increasing or decreasing in the world at this moment?
I mean, it's a really interesting question because in some ways, religious understanding is increasing, and in some ways, the most essential parts of religious understanding are decreasing. It's pretty well known that we have greater access to more information than ever before, and the kind of rapid rate at which we can find information is just increasing every single day, and so there's a lot of information out there, and people can access that very easily throughout the world. And so people are gaining a lot more information, but the notion of understanding or literacy, we're having a harder time, I think, across the board, discerning reliable information, which leads to greater understanding that is accurate, honest, reflects what religious individuals would say of their own tradition or their own selves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of the question is, what kind of information are we gaining, and is that deepening our understanding that is accurate and truthful and honest, or is it distorting what is maybe we would consider reliable information and truth about particular religious communities or practices or traditions?
Yeah. So it sounds like it's following a similar kind of epistemic dynamic that we've seen during this information age, which is the dramatic rise in availability of information through digital communications, but then concomitantly a dramatic decrease in the reliability of that information. So it falls to individuals to somehow know how to filter and sift that information to find what's actually true.
Yeah, and that's the both beauty and challenge of the age that we live in is it's that sifting part that's kind of difficult for many people, especially, as we move closer and closer to, AI being so pervasive in our communities and in our social media feeds, and learning to discern where information comes from, the sources that it's based on, that is directly tied to our religious literacy or our religious understanding today. And I think that we really need to think seriously about how do we help individuals, how do we help people within religious traditions find and access good information, and understand the process by which, as a researcher, as an academic, we're trained to think about sources. We're trained to think about, are they authentic? Are they accurate? But in the social media world, in just sort of the way in which algorithms work, it can be harder for people to figure out what's accurate and what's reliable.
What do you think the effect of this new generation of sort of algorithmic information, the era of the large language model, what effect do you think that will have on religious literacy? Do you think that will overall be a positive or negative?
Well, I think it bears potential to be very, very negative, as it puts out ideas that cast particular traditions, particular practices in a very negative light, or misconstrues them.
What would be an example of that?
Well, I think that, we've seen this over the past several decades, really, with regards to, say, Islam. The way that Islam gets painted sometimes in small sound bites, the way that it's talked about, even in some news sources, narrows the perspective on what's going on within Islam. And sometimes you hear only one sliver of that, and where there's a whole, there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, and the great majority wouldn't agree with one particular aspect of what's being portrayed in any one source or story. And so I think that we sometimes narrow it down and generalize very quickly. And so I think learning to recognize religious diversity within traditions and across traditions is actually a very important skill right now, that we need to develop a better way of approaching. When we say, okay, well, Catholics do this, do we mean every single Catholic does that? Or do we mean that there's some trends in one particular region of the world or one particular denomination within the Catholic Church? Like, how does that work? And so I think learning to recognize diversity will help strengthen our capacity for religious literacy.
Well, that's an important point, and I want to come back to it in just a minute. But first, I want to get clear in my mind, what is the relationship in the academic field of religious understanding, religious literacy, or interfaith engagement? What is the relationship between religious literacy and religious conflict? Is the hope that an increase in religious literacy will decrease religious conflict, or does the academic field take a sort of more modest approach and say, that's not really for us to be able to influence?
Yeah, the academic community that works in the spaces of religious studies or the study of religion really is calling for greater religious literacy. I work on Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe. Can you learn to recognize the role that religion has played in the shaping of history and politics in a place like, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, for example? Can you learn to understand the religious components that aren't always central to what's going on in Israel, in the Middle East right now? Can you learn to understand how individuals bring their religious bearings to any kind of situation, be it politics, be it social work, be it education? How does religious belief and practice influence other areas of life? And so I think that's one of the areas that academics are calling for, really programmatic developments in terms of what kinds of things do people need to have as a set of tools, a kind of toolkit they take into the world after they graduate from a university, after they begin their professional careers. Are they literate in these ways to be able to understand this is where this person may be coming from, and now I can approach that, my conversation with them or these negotiations or whatever it is, differently because I understand that. So I think there's a real call for that.
So is it your conviction that a person who, let's say that these calls are met and we do start producing citizens who have a deeper understanding and literacy in other religious traditions, is it your conviction that we should then see a kind of decrease in large-scale religious conflict, or is that too optimistic?
As we see religious literacy rise, there's the kind of academic learning that leads to a sort of religious literacy. I can read a lot of textbooks, or I can study a tradition for a long time. And that will, in and of itself, probably lead me to be more appreciative of another tradition or another group of people. But if there's no engagement on the personal level, on the community level, I probably struggle to put some of that learning into practice. And it remains on a kind of shallow level, which could then be, I could be moved pretty quickly one direction or the other, more positive or more negative, as I'm encountering news sources and things. So if I've engaged with somebody or a community for a long time, and I understand better because I've sat with them, I've talked with them, I've learned with them, maybe I've even worshiped with them, I am less likely to have a very negative opinion of the broad tradition that they come from.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hope.
Yeah. So. Yeah. That makes sense to me, that a kind of academic understanding that's supplemented with real life experience can genuinely make a difference in an individual's life. Sometimes, I get discouraged looking at these intractable, it feels like deeply intractable religious conflicts in Israel, Palestine, or in other places. And it can feel like, actually, what difference does it make if individuals sort of have this rosy, happy view? Really, this is about governments, this is about large scale forces. When I'm feeling optimistic, though, I can say, at least for regular people like you and me, this is a step that we can take, right? We can strive to increase our religious understanding and then put that into practice in our communities. And at least that's something that we can do. Whereas negotiating at kind of geopolitical levels is beyond what most of us are going to be able to do.
Of course, but I think that's a good point, because, even for those who are negotiating at the very high levels, sometimes if we're unaware of the ways that religious affiliation, religious practice plays in public life, we're not prepared to negotiate well, I think, because we'll overlook certain things that are sort of background inputs to the way that people come to the table to negotiate or solve problems. And so one side of that is if somebody who's negotiating at the highest level even has the basic levels of religious literacy, they may be more prepared to sit down and say, okay, I'm having this conversation with somebody and we disagree vehemently about something. But I can understand more of their perspective because I know where they're coming from and the values they hold and the way they think about the world. I think that's an important part of just being a human being in today's global, kind of globalized society is, do we have the basic parameters to then enter into honest and sincere conversations?
Yeah. So when we're bringing it back to kind of these individual one-on-one interactions, one of the giants in the field, one of the giant thinkers in this field is a man named Krister Stendahl. He was a Lutheran theologian and a biblical scholar, very influential in New Testament studies in the 20th century, taught at Harvard Divinity School for many years, and interestingly had a real connection and interest in Latter-day Saints through his friendship with Truman Madsen. And he wrote a very important article on the Book of Mormon, in fact, on the Christ of 3rd Nephi. But he had a lot to say as sort of at a foundational level for the ways that we can engage one another across confessional or religious differences. And in fact, he formulated these as 3 kind of laws or 3 rules. What are Stendahl's 3 rules of interfaith engagement?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Krister Stendahl, because it's hard to kind of navigate this world without at least paying a little bit of tribute to sort of the way he framed the question of what does it mean to come to the table as a human being with someone of another faith. And so for Krister Stendahl, his rules look at, the first one is simply go to the authentic sources. See if you can let the other person define themselves for you, rather than assume that you have enough information to define who they are and what they believe and how they believe or how they practice. So the first one is go to the authentic source. Ask them to define themselves. help you then refine what your understanding of their particular position is. The second one is to make sure that we're doing equal comparisons, comparing our best to their best or their best to our best, and being able to recognize that, of course, there are things in my tradition that I love and are probably a huge part of why I belong to any particular religious community. That is equally true of other people. And so as I look for the thing that is most endearing and precious to me in my tradition, can I find that in someone else's tradition? Whatever, it may be a different thing, but what is it that binds someone else to their practice and their tradition? And learning to do the comparison that way, rather than say, well, my community does this and this community does this thing really poorly, so that's why mine's better.
Yeah.
Right? We kind of do the kind of apples and oranges comparison sometimes that falls apart because we're not actually thinking in equal terms. We're not looking for the highest, most noble part of a particular community's practice or tradition. And then finally, the third rule is, can we leave space for what he calls holy envy? And holy envy is this idea that someone else is doing something that is beautiful, ennobling, meaningful, and I may not do that same thing in my community and in my own individual devotions. But what would it mean if I were to pause and say, how would it look if I were to develop a prayer life that scheduled, in a sense, 5 moments for prayer during the day? You know, what would that do if I were to try and orient my life in that way? What would it mean if I were to take Scripture and wrestle with it and really, ask a lot of questions of Scripture rather than assume that the Scripture is apparent in and of itself and therefore I don't need to dig into it? Those are traditions that, one comes from Islam, one comes from Judaism in the way that I see it. And I think there's something really beautiful about thinking as a Latter-day Saint, for example. How would I incorporate some element of that? What would change for me? What would be better for me if I were to do that? It's not going to look the exact same, and we can't really adopt wholesale certain practices. But even the idea that, they do something really beautiful that I don't do, that would help me if I could think of a way to incorporate something like that. And so that's where Krister Stendahl is, look at authentic sources, compare our best to their best, and then finally leave a little space for holy envy and deep appreciation.
Yeah. So my question is about the first of those, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. We might want to go to the authentic source and talk to the believer, him or herself, but there's immense internal diversity within any particular religious tradition. So how can you be sure that if you're talking to a person of the Muslim faith, that they represent kind of what Islam is about, or similar to Latter-day Saints, right? I think I could imagine myself being kind of dismayed if an academic researcher were to go to some of my fellow co-religionists and sort of take them, say, I'm going to the source. So what I'm getting then is true or is authentic. Right. So how do we cope with that problem?
I think that Aaron Hughes, who's a scholar, a Canadian scholar who works on Jewish philosophy and works on Islam, he has an insight that he talks about this insider and outsider debate, right? And he says you can't just trust the academic. You also have to have some level of engagement with the insider voice when you're studying someone else's practice. And the model there is, as I talk with my students all the time, as I said, if we wanted to take Aaron Hughes seriously, and you were trying to study, Buddhism, for example, what would it mean to treasure the insider voice? It wouldn't mean going just to one person. You would have to spend a lifetime meeting with different individuals. And as you meet with other individuals who have different perspectives from within that tradition, you start to get a more rounded sense of where the tradition comes from and what it means for people and how they practice it. And I think that's the challenge, is we're not going to get there in 2 months. We're not going to get there in a year. Here at BYU, we often talk about lifelong learners. I think that's what Krister Stendahl is calling for, is can you continually keep going back to the sources? And as you accumulate more information and more experience, you end up in a different place than you would have if you said, I'm going to study this tradition or this practice for 2 months and I'm going to be the expert. Yeah. We're just not doing that, right? And so there's that idea of, can I continue in the conversation for a long time? And that builds up over, that's just living your human life and having the experiences you have and seeking opportunities, I think. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we can at least mitigate um, the the reality that any one particular practitioner is going to have a partial view by trying to encounter many practitioners of a particular religious tradition, and then in ourselves we sift and we compare and we come to try to deeply understand, and over time we'll have a sense for kind of what are the mainstream currents in this tradition, what are the more minority reports, and we'll kind of have a way to balance and get a bigger picture. I think that's necessary
Yeah.
within our own religious tradition as well, right? I think we can apply this internally as well and say, um, can I begin to understand a wide swath of my own co-religionness?
Right.
And then when I'm called upon to speak as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I myself can begin to give an account of some of the internal diversity of our own religious tradition.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of interfaith engagement is actually, as you said, if we spend time learning about other people and the ways in which different communities have different ways of doing things, we start to recognize that in our own community better. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for most of us, we become more comfortable with internal, intra-faith discussions that show we don't always agree on every single point.
Yeah.
And that's actually a beautiful thing to recognize that there's diversity in my own community that I didn't see before, because I begin to see it from different perspectives and other people's relationships as well.
So yeah, let's say that we take these three rules to heart and we employ them in the broadest way that we can, and in the best faith that we can. What is the goal to which we are aiming? At one point in time, and I'll admit I still have some affection for this idea, what we're aiming for is a kind of religious toleration so
Hmm.
that we can live in a pluralistic society without kind of religious conflict, and can allow one another to practice the convictions of their conscience, while we practice the convictions of ours. Is that enough? Is toleration enough, or should we be pushing beyond that to something beyond religious tolerance?
Um, I think we should be pushing beyond religious tolerance. I think tolerance is a first step, which acknowledges that there's difference. And tolerance allows us to say, okay, I see the world in this way, and someone else sees it in another way, or they have a different perspective. And I can tolerate that. I can allow that to exist without needing to get rid of it. Um, as we move towards what we'd call pluralism, I think there's a different kind of engagement on that level, where it's not just that I tolerate someone else's practice, but I'm actually going to engage with it in some way. I'm going to talk to them about it. I'm going to learn from them. I'm going to try to get my head around, why do they do that? Where does it come from? And I'm also going to encourage them in that practice.
Hmm.
I think that's one of the challenges sometimes, is we say, well, I don't want to encourage someone else in a practice that isn't mine because mine's better.
Hmm.
Um, in reality, and I think the question of where is this all going, or what's the goal here, I think it's to allow individuals to find their way to a deeper understanding of who God is, of the way the world is shaped and works, and what we're trying to do as human beings. And I think if for Latter-day Saints, if you were to look at the articles of faith, for example, you'd find places where we're encouraging people to exercise their privilege to worship God in whatever way that looks. I think that's a challenge for us, is to say, well, if that's a fundamental truth that we hold to, how can I encourage someone to do that? Obviously, I'm going to encourage them to learn about my own tradition too, but how do I help somebody who just is looking for a deeper connection through a tradition that they're familiar with? There's a different stance there.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I think the way I was thinking about it was that the step beyond tolerance is that I have to affirm that I have to affirm their set of beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's asking a lot for a lot of people, and I do think that sometimes there's a virtue in minimalism and
Yeah,
saying live and let live is good enough, and
right.
let's not push people too far beyond that. But you're saying something different. You're not saying that once I move beyond tolerance, I have to myself affirm, what somebody else's set of beliefs or practices are, but instead that I can help them affirm the best in their tradition, right? I think that's a crucial difference. Maybe just talk me through. Let's say I had a wonderful, and this is very true from my life, and it rings true experientially for me. I had a wonderful friend who, and I still do, who is a refugee from Syria, very, very devout in her practice of Islam. What is it that I can gain, or what is the good that grows from my affirming her and encouraging her in her religious practice?
Yeah, I just had an experience with this just recently. We were at the funeral of my wife's grandmother, and at her parents' house, where people were gathering before and after the funeral. There was a family member who had with them a Muslim woman, and the family created a space in the front room where she could go and practice her, and do her prayers during the day. And it was a closed off area. She could shut the door, and there was privacy for her. But she could practice in a Latter-day Saint home her own religious practices. And I think there's just some element of just accommodation, right? If I'm inviting someone over to my home, can I find ways to be a good host and allow their dietary practices to be observed as much as possible, right? Can I create space for a friend, a colleague, to be able to do the thing that they need to do within their own tradition, while also not forcing them to be kind of highlighted in that or spotlighted, but let them just do their thing. And I think there's something about that, I think that's part of what hospitality and friendship looks like, is I'm not going to change you to be more like me, but part of the reason I actually enjoy being with you is because you're different than me. And let me learn from you. Let me understand how I can be better at that friendship or that hospitality. And so there's something beautiful about that is so human. And so I also think it's a religious act to let someone else practice their faith in a space that isn't theirs. If right, in a Latter-day Saint home, can we create space for that?
Yeah.
And what does that conversation that gets us to that point look like?
Yeah. Looking back at my life, I found that my richest friendships and relationships outside of my own faith tradition have been with other devout practitioners of other faith traditions. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but some of my closest friendships have been with an extremely devout Catholic, a wonderful Jewish woman who deeply treasures her faith, and as I was talking about, this wonderful my friend who is deeply connected to Islam from her Syrian roots. And if I ask myself, who do I think is who would I trust to give the best account of me and what my religion means to me? Would it be one of these women deeply embedded in a different, maybe you could even say rival, quote unquote, faith tradition? Or would it be a quote unquote objective secular person who has actually never had the experience of deep religious conviction? I think I would go to my friends who understand from the inside what it's like to hold deep religious convictions, even though they are in a different tradition themselves, right? There's something that's shared, which is the experience of conviction itself. And so encouraging them in their own faith in this kind of paradoxical way, I think can help them to understand me better and who I am. And in that way can increase the understanding between us.
Yeah, it's so interesting because for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I believe there's a kind of call for us to do just that, right? To reach out to people who don't see the world the same way we do, but look for the places where there's cooperative projects, where there's opportunities for service together. And as we do that, I think very often we find the partners who are willing and wanting to engage with us come from a position of religious practice or faith. This is modeled beautifully by so many of our church leaders. You look at Elder Gong, who was in Rome recently, talking about AI and making a case for religious cooperation because there are shared values there, because there are shared experiences and ideas and hopes for the world. You see it with President Camille Johnson speaking all over the world to communities and asking for us to exercise the two great commandments. And I always think about the two great commandments, this idea that I'm meant to love, God, and then love my neighbor. And if we think about the way in which we love God, it's done through devotions that are based in respect and awe and wonder. And I think as we come to our neighbors, what would it look like if we brought respect, wonder, and awe to that relationship? How would I learn to see them differently and the things they do and the things they can teach me differently? I think there's something beautiful about that idea that I can't have a different kind of or different approach to love to God and then to my neighbor, but actually to try and mirror in some ways the way that I love God might also have an impact on the way I love my neighbor.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. And I think you're right that especially of late, Latter-day Saints have been real leaders in this maybe growing desire to connect faith traditions in their own faith traditions. And as you mentioned, we see this in our highest leaders, in President Johnson, in President Oaks, right? He has spoken very insightfully about interfaith engagement. And it's interesting to think about why that's the case. So on the one hand, you might say, well, Latter-day Saints are a religious minority. It's always in the interest of the minority to foster a milieu of understanding and tolerance, because then we're less likely to be targeted as a religious minority. And that's probably true. And actually, and I don't think one needs to be cynical to recognize the value in that. It's important to listen to the voices of all kinds of minorities, religious minorities among them, precisely because they can tell us something that we are not able to understand if we're a part of the majority. But I think it so you can speak to that if you'd like. But I also think it goes beyond that, and we have a substantive basis, not only a pragmatic or strategic basis. We have a substantive basis and case for interfaith understanding in our own scripture. So I'd like you to lead us through some of the high points of that as well.
Yeah, let me see if I can approach both those questions in some way that makes any sense here. But you mentioned President Dallin H. Oaks. As I look at the way that he has done this, maybe through his entire life, but also it's more public more recently, obviously. He talks about this idea that when we are within our own religious communities, right? When I'm sitting in a worship service, when I'm participating with other members of my community, I am acting in certain ways and I hold certain convictions that I can be very open about. And then he says, in public, what religious persons say and do involves other considerations. The free exercise of religion covers most public actions, but it is subject to qualifications necessary to accommodate the beliefs and practices of others. And he's acknowledging that we have different modes of being religious individuals, right? The way I'm religious doesn't necessarily change, or what I'm religious about doesn't necessarily change. But in certain contexts, I have to be willing to speak differently. I have to be willing to open myself up to the world differently, and let people see my practice, through a different lens. And there's kind of it's not being disingenuous. It's just learning the cues and the codes that work in settings to be able to do that. And as I think about that, there is a need for us, that is more apparent now than it has ever been as Latter-day Saints. For a long time, we were a bit isolationist. We tried to withdraw a little bit from the public conversations. And there have been times where we've been more open and more public, and times when we've been withdrawn. And I think we're in a moment where we're definitely more public now. And it's not just because it's advantageous or useful to the church to be able to do that, but actually because we're leaning into the idea that we have something to offer. Yeah. Right. As we look at a world that's deeply polarized, is struggling to have good conversations of, built around the ideas of trust and fidelity to who we are. Latter-day Saints I think we're developing the tools that might be useful here. And I think that's important. President Nelson calling upon us to be peacemakers makes us lean out into the world and into our individual relationships differently, where the objective is to build peace, not to identify difference. And so I think there's something there. And then the other question you asked was thinking about kind of scriptural sources and motivations. I think there's so many that we could draw out. I think a careful reading of the New Testament shows us that there's always what we might call interfaith or interreligious conversations happening. So much of what Jesus Christ is doing in the New Testament is navigating religious difference and highlighting principles for us. You could look at Luke 10, for example, and the idea of a Samaritan, of course, Pharisees and Sadducees, right? These show up in the text all the time. And sometimes we skip past them because we create the religious other as the thing that's opposed to Jesus. Where I think if we were more careful readers of Scripture, we would learn to see the context in which Jesus is operating within a social milieu that has these kind of different opinions and practices playing out on the pages of Scripture for us. And so I think there's something that we could learn there. The Book of Mormon invites us to think about this. 2 Nephi 29 invites us to recognize that God continues in covenant with people that were covenanted long before Latter-day Saints were around. And that covenant matters. And so being aware of what that means, and not just what it means historically or in terms of the context of Scripture, but what it means for me as a person. My good friend, Rabbi Josh Garraway, once noted, he said, I appreciate the way that Latter-day Saints have an affection for an interest in Jews and Judaism. He said, but I also want Latter-day Saints and others to see me first as a human being, and then let my Jewishness, my Judaism kind of play out in that relationship, not as the thing that defines me, but shapes who I am.
Interesting. Maybe he's been approached a little too eagerly by
Definitely.
by well-meaning Latter-day Saints, right? Yep. Who are like, "Oh, you're Jewish. Well, do you want to know what our Scripture says about you?" And it kind of elevates him as a representative of a certain type of person before really getting to know who he is as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there's being good readers of Scripture and understanding the sources of our own tradition lets us see ways to deepen the way in which we talk about other communities. You don't have to go very far sometimes in Christian context to hear a kind of supersessionist claim, something that decries the law of Moses. But Jacob 4 allows us to see that the law of Moses is actually a way of being sanctified unto God. And I think there's clues that we can draw out from Scripture that say, okay, I have to think and talk differently about some things that maybe have been sort of just the language of my tradition for so long. And as I'm more careful about that, I think I can better reflect and more accurately reflect the way that we might want to talk about other traditions that is respectful and appreciative.
I very much agree with you that the Book of Mormon contains a powerful imperative to understand and to appreciate and to approach with respect and gratitude other religious traditions than our own. It leaves no question that God speaks to all nations and uses all of his children to bring about his purposes. That's 2 Nephi 29. But to be entirely faithful to the Book of Mormon, you also have to take into account 2 Nephi 28, right? Yep. Which talks about the ways in which in the latter days, many false churches will rise up and will attempt to deceive and to occlude the light that God is showering down on us. Very helpfully, I think President Oakes has given us a framework to deal with and to understand and contextualize those two different strands, right? What President Oakes says is you as you explained here, is that we have two different ways of talking about our religious faith. And one is entirely appropriate to when we are together as Latter-day Saints among ourselves, and we are celebrating and appreciating and digging into the unique gifts of the restoration. That's our 2 Nephi 28. And the other is entirely appropriate to when we are together with members of other religious traditions, or we're working together in public with people of no religious faith, right?
Yep.
And in that place and in that context, we have within our scriptures a whole different set of vocabulary and ideas, a whole different discourse that's entirely appropriate to that setting as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, Rosalynde. As you think about, to think about President Oaks for a second, here is the president of the church. Here is somebody who's been an apostle for decades, with the specific charge to testify of Jesus Christ and his life and his ministry, and to invite others to gain a greater understanding of that, right? And so he can operate in many modes as well, and he does so beautifully. He talks about us as he says, if you are a follower of Christ, we need to be examples of civility. We need to be good listeners. We need to love all people. We need to show concern for their sincere beliefs. And as we think about that, what does that look like? I think it looks like somebody who's willing to sit and listen and be curious, rather than needing to make their point first and strongest, right? That idea of being, seeking to understand before being understood, I think is something that he models so well. Can I sit and listen to somebody from another tradition? Can I find the shared values that would make me want to have a conversation and identify places where somebody who does not have any professed belief would want to work with me on a common project, to do something in the world, to make a change, to help solve a local issue around poverty or homelessness or food scarcity, right? Are there projects that people just care about? And why they care about it doesn't necessarily have to be the invitation for me to work with them or not work with them, right? But knowing they care and knowing that they have interest in it means that I can lean into that first and foremost, and all the other things will just sort of naturally develop, and we'll have better conversations because we are invested in something together.
You mentioned just sitting and listening and being curious, and leaning into the other person's experience. And I detect that maybe you're speaking from personal experience there. I wonder if you would share with me the most meaningful interfaith encounter that you've had.
So I've had a lot of different encounters, some positive, some negative. Part of the reason that I think got invested in interfaith efforts was a conversation where I was told that because I was a Latter-day Saint, I didn't have anything to offer a gathering of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And I took that a little bit personally, and maybe had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder to say, I think I have something to say, but but at the time, this was 15, 20 years ago, I didn't really know what I had to say. I was still trying to figure that out. And so for me, it's kind of become that interfaith engagement, which wasn't an overly positive one, really kind of motivated me to say, okay, what is it that my tradition, what is it that I as a Latter-day Saint have to offer the world that could solve some problems, that could reduce tension and kind of polarity among religious people. But for me, maybe the most meaningful interfaith experience, came through a project that we developed here at BYU with some of our Jewish colleagues. It was called the Jewish Latter-day Saint Academic Dialogue, and it was scholars and leaders coming together to try and talk about where the common points of interest were, where we differed. And it wasn't so much what we talked about; it was that we spent 7 years in conversation.
Wow.
We traveled together. We took our Jewish colleagues to Kirtland and showed them the kind of origins of the Latter-day Saint movement. We traveled to Israel together, So we spent a lot of time just talking and getting to know each other. And one of the beautiful parts of that has been that as things happen in the world, the tragedies in Michigan recently, it was many of my Jewish colleagues who reached out and said, we're thinking about you. We're thinking about your community. We're praying for your community.
I had that same experience.
Yeah.
It was my Jewish friends who reached
out.
out.
And we've had opportunities to do the same for them, right? Yeah. The Tree of Life incidents several years ago, we were able to kind of have a little bit of reciprocity in that. And there's something beautiful about the fact that someone else is thinking of you when life is really hard and you're feeling maybe attacked or persecuted, and knowing there's people out there who, because you have spent time with them, are willing to reach out and check in on you. And there's something just wonderful about the personal relationship that develops as you sit and talk with somebody over the course of 6, 7, 8 years and get to know them really well and their families. And you learn about what did their kids achieve? Did they graduate from law school? Or do they have a new grandchild? Whatever it is, right? There's just so many wonderful things you learn that aren't part of the academic conversation about religion, but become sort of central elements of the relationship.
Yeah. Well, as we draw our conversation to a close, we focus in this podcast on questions and the questions that we can ask, the questions we should be asking. So thinking about particularly this form of deep, personal, long-term and substantive interfaith engagement that goes beyond tolerance and reaches toward kind of mutual encouragement in our relationships to God. What there, Andy, are the questions that Latter-day Saints should be asking?
That's a big question. I think one of the questions we should be asking, and it's one that I don't think we're answering anytime soon. And it probably has constantly evolving answers to it. And it's one that I always leave my students with. I said, if you're a person of religious belief and you believe that God's working with you or on you or pushing you in certain directions, can we ask ourselves the question, what is God doing with someone else, right? Who isn't part of my tradition? Is God working on them? Is God pushing them in certain directions? And what does that mean for our relationship? That's one of the big questions. I think another question comes out of a 1978 First Presidency statement, which is called God's Love for All Mankind, in which the First Presidency articulates that God gave to individuals, mentions Confucius, Muhammad, Plato, Socrates, reformers, right? What did God give them? If I believe that God speaks to people, what did they get? And the only way I'm going to figure that out maybe is to spend a lot of time studying and learning from people who adhere to those particular traditions or ideas. And so one of the questions that is just, what is God doing in the world? I think that's a big question that we're not going to answer. I think another one is, where are the obvious points of connection with people that I haven't connected with yet? And what does their tradition tell them about that idea or that concern in the world? What are the cooperative moments for us? I think that we can learn a lot by understanding what other people do. There was a wonderful gathering of individuals, and they came here and they'd gone up to Welfare Square, and they saw Welfare Square, and they saw what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does in terms of humanitarian efforts and care and emergency relief and all of those things. And they came back and they said, why on earth have you not created the handbook for other communities to do this? Right? And in some ways, there's probably a lot of answers that I'm not qualified to give on why that's the case. But if you look at the way that the church does humanitarian care, it's not usually under the name of the church. It's usually through some other organization that resources are given, support is given, and then those organizations are the ones that are actually extending that out into communities. I think there's something beautiful about that idea that, can I think about what I could offer another community without having to take ownership of or claiming any kind of contribution to? What could I offer someone else's community that would let them do their work better or let them continue their work?
Well, at the Maxwell Institute, we love a big, meaty, unanswerable question, and those are some great ones. Andy Reid, thank you so much for joining me today on the
Absolutely.
Maxwell Institute podcast.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Andrew Reid, the Richard L. Evans Chair of Religious Understanding at BYU. As I mentioned at the top of the show, the insight that has stayed with me most from this conversation is Andy's reflection on the two great commandments. We approach God with respect, awe, and wonder. What would it look like to bring that same quality of attention to our neighbors, especially neighbors whose faith differs from our own? I came away convinced that the two great commandments turn religious tolerance into something deeper. I'll be back soon with another interview. Thanks for listening to the Maxwell Institute podcast.